Hacks is a show that's on HBO now. If you haven't watched it, you really should. I've watched the first 3 seasons, and I've just finished the season 4, which I can't really say if it's the best season or not, because here's the thing. When you're binging these shows, sometimes you forget about things, and thank God for the previously on that they have to show at the beginning of these things. In season 4, actually I should probably explain the basic concept of Hacks if you haven't seen the show. Basically, there's a character named Deborah Vance who was this legendary female Las Vegas comedian. And her material sort of got stale, and at one point in time, her representation basically hires a up-and-coming comedy writer named Ava Daniels to write her jokes. And a lot of the first 3 seasons are Ava and Deborah sort of clashing together as sort of an old generation of comics meets new. And they were working together to essentially find, as Deborah took her comic gigs and her career started to rise again. And then in season 4, or by season 4, Deborah has essentially found a gig as the full-time host of a late-night talk show. Now, here's the thing. Sometime in season 3, Deborah actually slept with the studio head, and then coincidentally, there was the job for her as the full-time late-night host after that. Now, this probably happens, okay, in Hollywood. It probably does. I have to say, Hacks is one of those shows that is like, say, The Studio, a show that I've also done a commentary about or a rant about, where essentially they always kind of turn the camera around, or these Hollywood shows turn the camera around to Hollywood, and they always show it being a very toxic workplace and a place where divas are in control, and and drugs get involved, and there's often, and of course, now, they show how sex gets involved too, and how this sort of thing just sort of happens. It happens under the radar. People sort of ignore it. And I think because we have the product of good television and good movies, that people just, for the most part, they just sort of let it slide. And this is the system that we're in now. And in this season, I think they made more of a commentary on that system that I really liked. And then here's the thing. Ava's character, played by the great Hannah Einbinder, who has a special on HBO called Everything Must Go. You should watch that if you haven't. It's very funny. She's a very funny gal. But here's the thing about this. Ava knew that Deborah had slept with the studio head, and there came a point in time where Deborah was hiring writers, and she chose a different head writer than Ava. And so Ava didn't like this, so she basically says, you make me your head writer, I'm going to tell the entire media that you slept with the studio head and then you got your show. And I thought, and of course, Deborah's trying to avoid the scandal, so she makes Ava her head writer. Now, right away, these two are just clashing, and they are just absolutely toxic to each other, and they are absolutely hating each other. And in fact, it gets so bad that I think the studio has to have a counselor between them working together on that. There's one episode in which they return to Las Vegas, because most of the previous seasons actually took place in Las Vegas. And I recognize the place where they were having this big argument here, because what happens is Ava hires a bunch of other writers to help out with the material that they're going to do on the show. And they have a little writer's retreat, and both Ava and Deborah go on this thing, and they are constantly disagreeing about how to do this. Now, at one point in time, Deborah sort of gets gets an illegal drug dealer to sort of kind of loosen him up, and I'm kind of going okay, I really hope this doesn't really happen in Hollywood. But something tells me this is probably happening, isn't it? They wouldn't show a scene like this unless there's some basis of truth in this. Right? Yeah, I know. I think I've talked about, when I was talking about The Studio, the Apple TV Plus show of a very similar nature, which, by the way, had Seth Rogen on it. And then also, I think there's an episode of The Studio which has Gene Smart's character on it. So are these taking place in the same universe? I don't think so, but who knows? Anyway, so there's a weird connection. So basically, what it comes down to is that there's just at one point in time, I think Ava reaches her breaking point and she quits her job there as head writer. And here's the thing. What's funny is how Deborah comes after her and wants to hire her back, which I think is it's really interesting, but I've seen this done before in a lot of films where a character gets to the breaking point and they have a bad relationship with somebody, and then it gets so bad that eventually the two characters have to resolve, and then eventually they kind of do. Now, this is actually where the show kind of gets interesting because even after all that resolution, there's still some conflict. There's a certain producer that Deborah Vance has been working with that she doesn't like, and this producer is played by Helen Hunt. And Helen Hunt is constantly breathing down her neck. And then here's the funny thing. Deborah Vance's late night show actually goes to #1 on the late night thing. And of course, they're feeling pretty good about it. By the way, I haven't mentioned this before, but I did mention that there is lots of commentary about the toxicity in the Hollywood atmosphere. And Hacks is also like the show The Studio because we see a lot of actors in the thing essentially playing themselves. And there is one scene that I have to admit was very hard for me to watch because it shows Jimmy Kimmel going up to Deborah Vance and absolutely angrily telling her that you can't steal my guess, and using very threatening language too. And I had to admit I was going like, this is pretty weird that you would have this. Because they could have just simply made up some character and they could have just easily not gotten the real Jimmy Kimmel to be this character, but they decided to go that direction. And so I thought that was kind of odd. Anyway, so remember that one producer I was telling you about, the one played by Helen Hunt? Deborah makes sure that she gets fired. And she does it by calling the studio head and basically making sure that that happens. And naturally, Ava is she's a little bit, she feels really something bad about that. Now, the one thing that you see on this show a lot is that Hollywood is really bad in this thing. You see the toxic atmosphere, you see the patriarchy happen a lot, and a lot of times Deborah Vance has to lose battles in order to gain some ground. And one of the things that happens is that there's a guest on her show that is apparently involved in some scandals. And at one point in time, Deborah, during the interview of this guy, makes a joke about those scandals. And since her show is not really necessarily live, they want to cut the part where they are going to do that. Now, Ava does not like that one bit. And so finally, Deborah comes around and basically just says like, you know what? I quit. This is not a good thing. You're obviously the studio is using its influence to defend somebody who's probably doing some pretty bad things, and Deborah decides to quit. Which is a really good scene. And not only that, she makes sure that Ava is fired beforehand because she knows that Ava would stop her from doing this. And so they both kind of go down together, but here's the thing. There is a bit of a victory there. The thing that I didn't really like about this thing is you never really see the fallout of this. Because after Ava and Deborah are essentially thrown out on the street, practically literally, from this job, they turn it around so that Deborah can take a job in Singapore. And there's actually this scene where Deborah is going to fly in her private plane to what Ava believes is Hawaii, but it's actually Singapore, which I kind of thought, like, can you really do that? I felt like it's probably, and then Ava is sort of surprised that they aren't in Hawaii, that they're actually in Singapore. And then from there, apparently, because here's the thing, when Deborah quit her job at the late night thing, there was a clause in her contract that she couldn't do any performance work for the next 18 months. But she found a way around that by going to Singapore, because she would tell jokes and then they'd have a translator do that. So apparently that is covered. I wasn't really sure what they are going with at the end of this thing, because apparently a false report came out that Deborah Vance was dead. Now, sometimes this comes out on a lot of actors and stuff like that. And apparently Deborah was so ticked off that they had called her retired that she immediately wanted to head back to the States. I don't know where this is going, although I do like this show, and you should watch it if you haven't.